The 1999 Izmit earthquake killed more than 17,000 people. All told, this was one of the most devastating seismic events in the world in the past 2 decades. For some geographical context, this is a view of Turkey from space. And the Izmit earthquake took place where the red dot is. This earthquake happened on a long fault called the North Anatolian Fault that's similar in many ways to the San Andreas Fault in California. As devastating as this 1999 earthquake was, it was by no means the largest earthquake that Turkey has experienced over the last century. In fact, it was just the most recent in a series of earthquakes since 1939. And as you watch this sequence of earthquakes, one of the most remarkable things about them is that they seem to be moving westward over time. And when you see something like this, the natural question is, well, what's next and where? Well, just extending this pattern in time and space, we might expect the next one to occur somewhere to the west of the 1999 earthquake. This has gotten a lot of attention because Istanbul, a city of more than 14 million people, is less than 50 kilometers from this part of the fault. And so in our research group, one of the questions that we're really trying to get at is, are these earthquakes somehow triggering one another? And if so, how? How could they be triggering one another when they're happening years to decades apart, and in some cases, hundreds of kilometers apart? What is the mechanism that could explain this? And if there is a mechanism that could explain this, what would it tell us about when we might expect the next earthquake to occur? Well, one mechanism that may be able to explain this is the behavior of the lower crust of the Earth. And when I say lower crust, I mean the crust beneath about 10 to 20 kilometers depth. So beneath the depth of most continental earthquakes. And specifically, the lower crust might behave as both a fluid and as a solid. There's a very familiar material that acts like this, silly putty. If you hit it with a hammer, it acts like a solid. But if you knead it and deform it more slowly, it flows much more like a fluid. In the same way, when an earthquake happens in the upper crust, it stresses the upper crust around it and the lower crust beneath it, but then over years to decades after the earthquake, the lower crust might be able to flow in response to those earthquake stresses. So this is a mechanism that could explain why, years to decades after one earthquake, another earthquake is triggered, because the crust may be still adjusting to that first earthquake long after it happens. And so in my PhD, I spent 3 years working on a computational code to calculate the changes in the crust over time and the stress evolution in the crust over time after large earthquakes. And with this code, we can now look at what effect each of these earthquakes in Turkey may have had on the next one in the sequence, due to the effects of a lower crust. So again, here is Turkey with Istanbul and the North Anatolian Fault. And we can make this map grayscale and then rotate our view down to look along the fault. This is now immediately after the 1939 earthquake. So the red parts of the fault highlight the parts of the fault that have already ruptured, and the yellow dot highlights the location of the next earthquake in the sequence. In this case, the 1942 earthquake. And as you watch the time-dependent stresses evolve up until the day before the 1942 earthquake, you can see that now, at the location of this next earthquake, the yellow dot, the time-dependent stress is red or increased. And as you watch the rest of the sequence of earthquakes, a similar story is true for each of the other events. That is, based on these model calculations, it seems like the time-dependent effects of the past earthquakes may be promoting the occurrence of the future earthquakes. And in fact, we can infer, based on the median time-dependent stress threshold at which these past earthquakes have occurred, that the part of the fault closest to Istanbul may reach this median threshold between 2015 and 2032. So overall, with these kinds of calculations, we're trying to understand stress evolution and earthquake interactions, not just in Turkey, but around the world. This is a heat map of population density worldwide. So the brightest areas represent the most densely populated areas. Overlaid now on top are the world's most active fault zones. Over 15% of the world's population lives close to these active faults. And as you've seen here, in our research group, we study not just what happens across these faults during earthquakes, but also what happens across them between earthquakes. It might seem counterintuitive to focus on this because it's the earthquakes that cause the damage. But understanding what happens across these faults between earthquakes might be key to trying to answer the most important question for the hundreds of millions of people who live close to these active faults today. Not just where these large earthquakes are going to occur, but when.